They did not drift into the sunset with halos and hymns. They walked into courts, markets, deserts, and storm-tossed harbors, and the empire hit back. The ends of Jesus' 12 apostles were not polished paintings. They were ashes, blades, ropes, and river stones. The record is messy, some of it carved in scripture, some whispered by bishops, some shouted by later martyrologies. Threads overlap, names double. Geography stretches from Jerusalem to Rome, from Armenia to India, and every thread is tied with a grim knot. The 12 did not leave comfortable myths. They left blood in the dust. Start with the fisherman who became a rock. Simon Peter dies in Rome under Nero around AD 64 to 67. Not through a peaceful old age, but under the shadow of torches Nero lit after the Great Fire. Tacitus, a Roman senator writing in Annals 15.44, never names Peter, but he describes Christians being nailed up, torn by dogs, set ablaze to light the emperor's gardens. A Roman presbyter named Gaius, quoted by Eusebius in the early 300s s, points to a trophy on Vatican Hill, and another on the Ostian Way memorials for Peter and Paul. By the late 2nd century, Clement of Rome, in a letter around AD 96, memorializes Peter's martyrdom as a model of endurance. Origen, a century later, adds the detail that Peter chose to be crucified upside down, not out of theatrics, but because he considered himself unworthy to die in the same posture as his Lord, beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Archaeologists in the 20th century found a necropolis, a red-plastered wall scribbled with ancient graffiti, and a hidden niche with bones reburied in the 4th century, and identified by Margherita Guarducci as belonging to a man in his 60s, wrapped in purple thread with gold, a burial reserved for a revered figure. The empire built a circus where Peter died. The church built a basilica where Peter lay. The rock was pierced and planted like a cornerstone. Peter's brother Andrew dies across the Ionian Sea. Patras, Greece, remembers a cross that looks like a saltire, an X, the Seon, Andrew's cross that later flies over Scotland and the corners of medieval maps. Earlier sources emphasize crucifixion without that shape. The Acts of Andrew, a 2nd or 3rd century text, tells a dramatic narrative. Later tradition in the 10th century crystallizes the X-shaped cross. Greek memory says he was bound, not nailed, so the suffering would last longer, and he preached for days to onlookers from the beam. The details shift depending on whose martyrology you read, but one element never shifts. Andrew dies on a cross at Patras, and the trade routes he once fished now carry his story through Constantinople, Amalfi, and beyond. The fisherman died with his arms stretched out like nets. James, the son of Zebedee, receives the briefest, hardest line in the New Testament. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Acts 12:2 is a Roman-style death notice packed into 9 words. Herod Agrippa I, grandson of Herod the Great, ordered it around AD 44. A single stroke, the standard Roman method for execution by blade, possibly outside the city where executions happened. The earliest martyrdom among the 12 recorded in Scripture itself is clipped and clinical. Later, Clement of Alexandria, cited by Eusebius, preserves a memory that the guard who led James to trial saw his courage, confessed Christ, and was executed alongside him. The book of Acts moves on within a verse. Jerusalem did not. One of its thunder sons fell to a sword, and the church felt the shock. The other thunder son, John, lives a long time with a target on his back. He becomes the outlying member of the 12, the one who dies of natural causes after a life steeped in exile and threat. Irenaeus of Lyons, writing around AD 180, says John lived into the time of Trajan, which means at least AD 98, and likely into the opening years of the 2nd century. Tertullian adds a story scattered like embers through late 2nd and early 3rd century Rome. John plunged into a vat of boiling oil near the Latin Gate, miraculously preserved, then exiled to the island of Patmos under Domitian. Eusebius confirms the exile, linking it to Domitian's reign and John's release after the emperor died in AD 96. In Ephesus, the tomb of John sits under a ruined basilica, its columns toppled, its floor stones cracked. The apostle who wrote of light walked through fire and outlived a generation of martyrs. His end is not a spectacle of blades, but a long, slow resistance, a living martyrdom that stretched across decades. Exile, oil, old age, the sacred exhaustion of a life poured out without a public executioner's blade. Philip's end turns the map toward Phrygia and raises a cloud of scholarly dust. Early writers like Eusebius and Polycrates of Ephesus speak of Philip, his daughters who prophesied, and his burial at Hierapolis. The trouble comes with the name. The New Testament includes Philip the Apostle and Philip the Evangelist. Papias, quoted by Eusebius, mentions Philip who lived at Hierapolis with his prophet daughters, and many modern scholars think that Philip was the evangelist. Yet later tradition, and a discovery announced in 2011 by archaeologist Francesco de Andrea, points to a martyrdom and a tomb at Hierapolis venerated as that of the apostle. The Acts of Philip, an apocryphal text, paints his death as crucifixion upside down with Bartholomew, with a riot and a last-minute release for his companion, but not for Philip. Another tradition says he was pierced or stoned. The street-level reality remains visible in Hierapolis's collapsing arches and calcium-white terraces. Someone named Philip died there, honored, remembered, mourned. Bartholomew meets a death whose brutality leaves a mark on medieval art. Laid alive and then beheaded is the line many traditions repeat. Set in places called Albanopolis in Armenia, or in the region of Greater Armenia near Derbend on the Caspian, or even in areas ancient writers called India. The earliest strong link places Bartholomew in Armenia, and iconography persistently hands him a flaying knife and his own skin draped over his arm. Eusebius records that Pantaenus, a teacher from Alexandria around AD 180, journeyed to India, where he found a copy of Matthew's Gospel in Hebrew that Bartholomew had supposedly left behind. Ancient India covered everything from Ethiopia to Arabia to the west coast of the subcontinent, so the geography stretches like warm taffy, but the thread is consistent. Bartholomew trekked far beyond Judea, and he did not come back. He died under blades meant for hides. Matthew stands at the crossroads of tax ledgers and martyr lists. The former tax collector becomes the gospel writer, and the late 1st and early 2nd century sources scatter him across the East. Clement of Alexandria speaks of Matthew's way of life. Eusebius compiles strands, noting that some say Matthew wrote his gospel for the Hebrews before departing to other nations. The earliest churches remember Matthew in regions like Parthia and Ethiopia, and the Roman martyrology plants his martyrdom in Ethiopia by the sword. The details of place shift. Some say it was a city named Nadabar. Others simply say Ethiopia, a term that often meant Nubia, or land south of Egypt. Eastern traditions sometimes place him in Persia. Almost all climax with blood. A blade, a surprised congregation, a public killing while he proclaimed. The exact city fades like sand under the wind. The end is solid. Matthew the evangelist dies as a martyr, a public official turned public witness to the point of steel. Thomas, called the twin, walks off the edges of Roman maps. Eusebius places him in Parthia. The Acts of Thomas, a 3rd century Syriac text, sends him to India, marrying apostolic proclamation to ancient trade routes, linking the Red Sea to the Malabar coast. South Indian tradition thickens the story with locations you can stand on today. Mylapore, in present-day Chennai, guards a hill known as St. Thomas Mount, where he was speared by soldiers. The San Tome Basilica claims his tomb. Syrian Christians of Kerala, the Nasranis, trace their ancestry to the 1st century and call themselves the Church of St. Thomas. Ancient travelers like Pantaenus around AD 180, also reached India and found traces of earlier Christian teaching. Even if every detail in the Acts of Thomas reads like a sermon in the shape of a story, one detail refuses to be dismissed: the end. The apostle dies by spearing, the very act that once convinced him a wound could prove a resurrection. A spear takes Thomas down on a trade route that carried spices, beads, and now the message he carried. James, the son of Alphaeus, moves through history like a shadow. Some equate him with James the Less, and even with James, the brother of the Lord. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, records the death of James, the brother of Jesus who is called the Christ, stoned in AD 62, after a hasty trial when a Roman governor had died and the new one had not yet arrived. That James is the leader of the Jerusalem church, the author of the Epistle of James according to tradition, and not necessarily the Apostle James, the son of Alphaeus. Later writers try to harmonize names, and the harmonization bleeds into martyr stories. Hippolytus of Rome, in a list attributed to him, says James, the son of Alphaeus, was stoned and then clubbed to death. Medieval sources swap locations from Jerusalem to Egypt. Another thread says he died by crucifixion in Egypt. The symbol assigned to him in Christian art is a fuller's club, the tool used to beat cloth that becomes the tool for beating a man. The historical fog never lifts entirely. The apostolic catalog needed a grisly punctuation mark, and later centuries supplied it. What remains consistent is the pattern every early Christian knew all too well. The path out of Jerusalem often ended under stones. Jude, also called Thaddeus, and listed in Luke as Judas, son of James, carries a life that braided into an enduring legend. Eusebius recounts a tale of King Abgar of Edessa writing to Jesus and receiving a reply promising to send a disciple after the ascension. That disciple in Eusebius is Thaddeus, one of the 70, not the 12, which makes scholars press the brakes. The Edessan tradition grew around a figure called Addai, or Thaddeus, who evangelized the city. Whether the 12's Jude and Edessa's Addai are the same person remains debated. Later tradition rolls them together and drives them east. Jude preaches in Mesopotamia and Persia. He dies a martyr's death, sometimes with a club, sometimes by axes, sometimes alongside Simon the Zealot. The image of him with a halberd, like a long axe, appears in Western iconography, crystallizing his end as a beating or a hacking death. In a region that swallowed so many names between the Tigris and the Indigo Mountains of Media, Simon the Zealot is the apostle with a dagger in his name, and a dozen graves in tradition. The label zealot may mark his former alignment with a revolutionary movement, or simply a passionate temperament. Later stories scatter him widely. Crucified in Persia, sawn in half in Persia, suffering in Syrian cities, possibly preaching as far west as Britain according to a late and unreliable anthology, dying peacefully in Edessa according to another. The Ethiopian Synaxarium places him in Jerusalem. The Golden Legend plants him in Persia with Jude. The most consistent Western iconography hands him a saw. Eastern martyrologies sometimes put him at the same place and time as Jude, slain together in Persia, by the sword or the saw, around the middle of the 1st century. The method is gruesome. The geography is not pinned to one dot. What stays solid is the echo of a movement that often confronted imperial force with bodies, not blades. The zeal that once could have burned Rome's granaries ended up burning at a stake of witness instead. And then the apostle whose end does not resemble theirs, Judas Iscariot, dies by his own hand. The New Testament preserves two strongly worded accounts that converge like a crash. Matthew 27:3-10 says Judas returned the 30 pieces of silver and hanged himself, and that the chief priests bought a potter's field with the money, calling it the field of blood. Acts 1:18-19 says, Judas acquired a field with the reward, and fell headlong, burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out, and the place became known as Akeldama. the field of blood. Harmonization is straightforward and raw. A hanging, a rope, or branch that fails. A body that falls and splits. A field bought with blood money under the law's twisted technicalities. The Valley of Hinnom, south of Jerusalem, long associated with refuse fires and ritual impurity, is where tradition points for a Keldama. There is no martyr's crown here, only a noose and a shattered body. The 12 include a betrayer, and the early church made no attempt to airbrush him out. The roll call of deaths does not skip the darkest line. The list of ends is heavy, and the old sources often speak with the voice of a courtroom scribe rather than a novelist. That bluntness is what makes the next stories ring. The empire that thought it could stamp out a movement with death notices ended up stamping out a map of martyr shrine. Philip City, Hierapolis, eventually linked to Bartholomew's agony through pious memory. Andrew's Patras tied his X-shaped cross to a nation's flag long after the Romans folded. Thomas's spear point pressed into South Indian identity. Peter's cross anchored the heart of Roman Christianity. These ends were patient hammers, tapping slowly on continental plates of culture. The minor characters in these ends are not so minor. Herod Agrippa I, who ordered James the son of Zebedee executed, died in AD 44 in Caesarea, after a public display in which a robe glittered and a crowd shouted. Josephus narrates that death with unsparing detail and links it to pride, while Acts connects it to divine judgment. Nero's court that framed the crucifixion of Peter and the beheading of Paul in the same years, the mid-60s, acted after a fire-scarred Rome in July AD 64. Tacitus describes the gruesome ingenuity of those punishments. Domitian's paranoia underwrote John's exile. Rome's governors and client kings drift in and out like minor villains in a play, but each held a sword or a writ that sealed endings. The spaces where those ends happened still carry local weight. Patras builds a shrine with a preserved cross shape. Hierapolis's ruins hold a martyrium with crisp crosses carved into pillars. Mylapore sanctifies a hill and a church over a grave. Rome layers basilicas over imperial memory, like new skin over a burned back. You can walk into the Basilica of San Giovanni a Porta Latina, the site linked to the oil story of John, and see the pool where the legend says, "The oil boiled." You can stand under the sky at Akeldama and feel the silence. These are not fantasy coordinates. They are living arguments, carved in stone and built into procession. Even with this weight, the record requires caution. Fox's Book of Martyrs, beloved and stirring, pours gasoline on embers of truth with some later additions. The Golden Legend spins shimmering tales with the Acts of Andrew and the Acts of Philip, read like sermon cycles, not court transcripts. Scholarship splits hairs on what belongs to which Philip, whether Jude is a die, whether James son of Alphaeus suffered what James the Just did. The faithful memory is not a neat filing cabinet. It is a vault where truth and tradition sit together, sharing air. Yet certain anchors hold fast. James the son of Zebedee dies by the sword in AD 44 in Jerusalem. That one stands on the granite of Acts. Peter and Paul die in Rome under Nero. Those are attested by Clement, Gaius, and Eusebius, with Tacitus describing the general persecution that made such martyrdoms likely. John lives into the age of Trajan after exile to Patmos under Domitian, a story that grounds the writing of Revelation and the legacy of Ephesus. Thomas is remembered in India with stubborn continuity, even before Portuguese chroniclers wrote it down. Bartholomew's flame appears so early and often in art that it becomes part of Western Christianity's cultural DNA. These anchors shape the continental lines of the story, while the local streams of tradition flow around them. The geography of endings reads like a trade itinerary. Jerusalem to Rome, Judea to Phrygia, Syria to Persia, Persia to India, Galilee to Armenia, Palestine to Ethiopia. The apostles leveraged Roman roads, Greek language in Jewish scripture, and bled out across borders that travel writers in the first century loved to name. Their ends tell the same story their beginnings did. God picks ordinary men with calloused hands and sends them into every realm, including the realm of death. Peter's last hours did not erase his failure in a courtyard or his restored commission by a lakeside fire. That restoration sealed his end as much as any Roman writ. The shepherd would be led where he did not want to go, a path Jesus foretold in John 21, and the fisherman's sandals found it. Andrew's cross is more than a geometry exercise. The X-cross tradition attaches itself to a fisherman's stretch of arms and the refusal to recant. James, the son of Zebedee's quick death, matches the swift thunder of his nickname. John's long life and exile shape a particular endurance. An apostle can be a martyr without a public execution, when exile slices day after day. Philip's Hierapolis story carries a puzzle that good historians keep open in front of them like a wound that won't close. Eusebius pulls in lines from Papias and Polycrates that could point to the evangelist, not the apostle. Later archaeology and devotion point in the other direction. The ruins do not answer, they whisper. Bartholomew's flayed figure in Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, carrying his own skin, tells you how deeply that end shaped Christian imagination. Pain becomes a testimony, like a fresco. Matthew's end lingers like a courtroom account gone silent when the clerk leaves. The Roman martyrology's line, that he died in Ethiopia by the sword, gives a clean ending. Multiple Eastern lines place him under other skies, but they retain the blade's glint. Thomas's spear ties directly into one of the most gripping moments in the Gospels, not because of scripted irony, but because the independent weight of Indian tradition meets the theological turning point of a disciple who once probed a wound. Jude's link with Edessa's King Abgar and the healing of a ruler drifts between apostolic identity and the 70. But the final beat is steady. He dies violently in the east. Simon, the zealot scatter of deaths, matches the scatter of zeal, in a land always on the edge of revolt. Then there is the apostle, the early church replaced. The 12 lost Judas and drew lots in Acts 1, and Matthias stepped in. The topic remains focused on the original 12, and yet the replacement's end completes the grim geometry of the early movement. Traditions say Matthias was stoned and beheaded in Jerusalem, or suffered in Colchis near the Black Sea. His story illustrates a principle that shaped the group. Vacancies were not left open, and the cost of standing in that circle was life itself. The 12 fold into the story of their master by the way they ended. Rome expected fear to flow from crucifixions and beheadings. Instead, courage flowed. A fisherman's cross became a meeting point of nations. A boiling cauldron became a story of endurance and grace. A sword stroke became the first line in a catalogue of names that a bishop in the 2nd century used to steady a frightened church. The ends became evidence. The skepticism that refuses to baptize every late legend as fact does not erase the reality of these deaths. A conservative reading still leaves a string of martyrs that begins within 2 decades of the crucifixion and spans an empire. A sober reading of Eusebius does not dismiss local traditions. It weighs them. A careful gaze through Tacitus's clipped Latin does not neglect Clement's pastoral tone. The sources speak in different genres, but point in the same direction. The apostles died for the name they refused to renounce. The empire's punishments created a gallery of emblems. Peter's keys and upside-down cross. Andrew's saltire. James's scallop shell adopted later by pilgrims walking to a medieval shrine in Spain that claimed his translated remains. John's chalice, sometimes shown with a serpent, a symbol linked to legend about poison resisted. Philip's cross with a long staff. Bartholomew's flaying knife. Matthew's sword or axe. Thomas's spear. James, son of Alphaeus's fuller's club. Jude's halberd. Simon's saw. Judas's bag of silver. These emblems carved doctrines into memory, catechisms into metal and wood. They were illustrated sermons about cost, Their ends also created a pressure point for doubters and persecutors. If the apostles concocted a story for gain, they earned spectacle and a short life rather than villas and pensions. If their message found only local echoes, these ends would have faded like many failed movements. Instead, their deaths generated communities who named children after them and built cities around their shrines. Patras' cross, Rome's basilica, Ephesus's ruins, Mylopore's hill, Edessa's legends, Armenia's monuments. These are not the trace of a clever hoax. They are the footprint of a movement, tested by hammers and fires. The timeline sharpens the point. Jesus dies around AD 33. Within roughly a decade, James, son of Zebedee, falls by the sword. By the mid-60s, Peter is crucified and Paul beheaded. John, older and steady, survives into Trajan's age, exiled, and then returned. In roughly one generation, the leaders of the movement move from fishing and tax booths to crosses and swords. The line is steep and unembellished. It reads like Roman history because it is Roman history. The 12's tragic ends pull in the early voices of the church like a chorus. Clement of Rome consoles a traumatized community by pointing to the examples of Peter and Paul. Irenaeus anchors traditions in his teacher Polycarp, who knew John. Tertullian, the hard-edged African writer, catalogues the story of John in oil and of Nero's persecutions. Eusebius, the first great church historian, compiles early letter fragments and memorials, aware of legend, but hunting for fact. Josephus, an outsider, tells what Jerusalem's power brokers did to James the Just, a story that shows the ambient risk for any high-profile follower of Jesus in that city. Tacitus and Suetonius and Pliny the Younger speak of the same movement in cold Roman prose. The choir is not singing fairy tales. It is reciting depositions and testimonies. The apostles' ends also frame the church's later ethics. Martyrdom was not sought. It was faced. Early Christian texts warn against chasing death as if that were piety. They honor it, yes, but they frame it as a last cost when no recanting would do. The apostles' ends are not calculated PR moves. They are the corner cases of fidelity in a world ruled by imperial cults and local gods entwined with commerce and politics. When Andrew refused to deny Christ on a Greek coast, or Thomas pressed into a king's court in India, they did not run toward death. They ran toward proclamation, and death ran at them. The image of Judas hanging under a Jerusalem sun, and the image of Peter crucified under Nero's torches, sit like two bookends. Betrayal at one end, fidelity at the other. Between them, 11 men carry their message into regions that do not ask for it, and often punish it. James dies by a sword, and the church keeps singing. John dies in his bed after exile, and the church keeps building. Bartholomew's skin is peeled, and icons begin to teach illiterate congregations with knives and saints' faces. Matthew is cut down, and scribes keep copying his life of Jesus. Thomas falls under spears, and fishermen on the Malabar coast keep their liturgy in an ancient sing-song Syriac. Philip collapses under either stones or a cross, and a martyrdom rises over his bones. Jude and Simon are cut, and their feast day brings two names together like a final embrace. The ends are tragic, and the tragedy is not the end. The stories do not float free. They live in the bedrock of cities, the stones under basilicas, the manuscripts and marginal notes, the flags and festivals, the surnames and baptisms. They are woven into how Christians name their children and their cathedrals, how they design their stained glass, and how they date their pilgrim routes. Try to pull the ends out, and entire arches of cultural memory collapse. These are not sanitized stories. They involve oil and iron, swords and saws, clubs and rope, judges and mobs, emperors and clients. They force a reckoning with the cost of witness in a world that thinks execution is a cure for dissent. The apostles' ends say otherwise. Execution amplified their words. The rock cracked and the water surged. The saw bit and the city remembered. The spear struck and a church sang in a language older than Latin. Their ends also redraw the story of success. In Roman terms, they failed. No statues, no senatorial careers, no tracts of land. In Christian terms, they succeeded beyond calculation. By the time Trajan writes to Pliny the Younger around AD 112, asking how to handle Christians in Asia Minor, the movement is everywhere. Pliny calls it a contagion. He lists simple ethical behaviors and a stubborn refusal to curse Christ. He executes those who refuse and releases those who recant. The 12 lit that feud. Their deaths did not extinguish it. They fed it. When a basilica rises over an apostolic tomb, the stones are not trophies, they are arguments. Peter's bones under miles of marble counter the anxious idea that the first leaders were fictional. The pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela, even if built on later traditions and translations, testify to a human impulse to trace the steps of the saints. Patras' St. Andrew's Cathedral, Amalfi's treasury of Andrew's relics, the Basilica of St. Mary, John in Selkirk, Santhom Basilica in Chennai, the monastery of St. Bartholomew on the Tiber. These are ancient footnotes, carved in stone. The stories of their ends carry a warning too. Faith without cost fades. The documents that catalog their deaths read like last wills and testaments. They bequeath to their communities a way of facing emperors and local magistrates without flinching. Their names appear in court records and in legends because they stood still while others ran. Their ends were not waste. They were seeds sown harshly, watered with tears, harvested in songs. The 12 walked away from nets, booths, and zealot dreams, and they reached coasts and deserts they could not have named at the start. The end of each line looks like a cliff. Every cliff became a ledge for someone else, and the ledges turned into cathedrals and songs and communities and laws and calendars. The empire wrote death warrants. The apostles' ends wrote beginnings.